federal policy for the U.S. government on this issue. The Surgeon General of the United States, Dr. C. Everett Koop. It's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Koop back to the school. He was here last September celebrating the 50th anniversary of the school and the 350th birthday of Harvard in the Smoking Symposium, which some of you will remember. The nation's chief health officer, Dr. Koop, advises the public on matters ranging from environmental health hazards to diet and nutrition to disease prevention. A distinguished pediatric surgeon with an international reputation in his prior incarnation, Dr. Koop has had a long career in medicine and public health. Before joining the U.S. Public Health Service, he served as Surgeon-in-Chief of Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and Professor of Pediatric Surgery and Pediatrics at the University of Pennsylvania. He's a graduate of Dartmouth College, Cornell Medical College, and the University of Pennsylvania. He's also the Director of the Office of International Health. Dr. Koop recently submitted a report to Congress that outlined his proposals for combating AIDS, a report that's generated a great deal of attention and controversy, putting him in the eye of this storm. Dr. Koop is joined tonight on the panel by Loretta McLaughlin of the Boston Globe. After Dr. Koop has spoken, Ms. McLaughlin will be introduced by Val Southern, a graduate student here at the school representing several student organizations that are co-sponsoring this event with the Institute of Politics. Join me tonight in giving a warm welcome back to Dr. Everett Koop.
Thank you very much. I hear people say that they spoke where people were hanging from the chandeliers, and maybe this is the first time I've been in such a place. But I am delighted to return to this podium once again. This time I'm going to talk not about smoking, but about another quite serious public health matter. Like smoking, the threat of AIDS also turns on the personal behavior of millions of Americans, but unlike smoking, AIDS is still a mystery. With your indulgence, let me touch lightly on the recent history of the disease, and then I want to explore some of the key questions it poses to society today. I'll do that in the course of telling you a little bit about my report on AIDS. First, the little history. Almost 6 years ago, in June of 1981, the Public Health Service, through the Centers of Disease Control in Atlanta, which collects information from state health agencies, began to get some alarming reports. It was informed of 5 cases of pneumocystis carinii pneumonia in Los Angeles. Now, 5 cases is not much ordinarily in medicine, but this lethal disease is so rare that just a handful of cases in a single year is like an epidemic. Soon the reports trickled in of other such cases occurring in other cities as well. Our people investigated, and the trail led to many people who, for some mysterious reason, were sick and their bodies were not fighting back as you'd expect them to. As a result, they were not only sick with this very dangerous form of infectious pneumonia, they were dying from it, and no one seemed to know why. It appeared that otherwise healthy, normal people were acquiring some kind of a bug, a virus most likely, that attacked and apparently destroyed the natural immune systems of these individuals. The odd thing was that the virus itself was not killing people. People were dying instead of extremely virulent diseases because something prevented the body from fighting them off. Now, we'd never come upon a syndrome like this before, and so we gave it a somewhat awkward title. We called it the Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome. We soon just settled for the initials A.I.D.S. Then we called it AIDS, and it has been AIDS ever since. Now, I know you've read the stories about it, and you've seen a lot about it on television, and I'm not going to go through the entire 6-year history all over again. Instead, I'll just touch a few key points. First of all, we're talking about a disease that is spreading. The number of victims is doubling in little more than a year. For example, as of January 1986, we had a cumulative total of 16,000 reported cases. Today, that total is 30,000. By the way, over half of them have died, and the rest will. Last year we had over 13,000 new cases added to the total, and this year we expect to add 23,000 new cases. By the end of 1990, the cumulative total will be close to 270,000, and in that year, 54,000 people will die from this syndrome. Make no mistake about it, AIDS is spreading among more people, and it is fatal. After looking at all of the information we now have, my boss, Dr. Otis Bowen, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, likened the spreading AIDS situation to the arrival and spread of smallpox and the bubonic plague in Europe several centuries ago. My second point, even though scientists have had a look at the AIDS virus, we really don't know what it is, and unless we know that, we have no way of stopping it. Yes, we're making progress in the research effort, but it's very slow going. In 1984, the search was narrowed down to something called a human retrovirus, and our scientists at the National Cancer Institute were even able to pinpoint a specific one. They called it the human T-cell lymphotrophic virus type 3, or simply HTLV3. Apparently, the same virus showed up in the work of the Pasteur Institute scientists, where it became known as lymphadenopathy-associated virus, or as the French call it, LAV. Scientists have now agreed by consensus to call it by the single common name of human immunodeficiency virus, or HIV. Now, this was a very important step because we knew where the virus was. We were then able to recognize the presence of antibodies specific to the AIDS virus and in an individual's blood serum. Of course, those antibodies aren't very effective, but they're present nevertheless. And as of 1985, we've had a test that can detect the presence of these antibodies in a person's bloodstream. On the basis of such testing so far, plus other epidemiologic studies, we believe there are between 1 million and 1.5 million Americans with the AIDS virus in their systems, and I believe that that is on the low side. They have AIDS, but they aren't yet sick with an AIDS-related disease, such as pneumocystis carini or Kaposi sarcoma or one of the virulent megaloviral diseases. One major complication is the length of the incubation period. It apparently can be anywhere from a year or so in some people to 10 years in others. If our computations are correct, that is. So we still can't predict definitely which HIV carrier will or will not get an AIDS-related disease. But the risk is very, very high. In fact, some researchers now feel that anyone with the AIDS virus will eventually contract an AIDS-related disease. And the mortality rate for people with AIDS-related diseases appears to be, unfortunately, 100%. There's other research going on as well. I'm sure you've read about this or that drug being tested on AIDS patients. The media, for example, have given much coverage to one drug, and that one is known as AZT. It seems to prolong the lives of some AIDS victims dying of pneumocystis carini pneumonia. But I'm afraid that's all that AZT does. It prolongs some lives. It does not save them. People ask me, Dr. Koop, when are we going to have an effective vaccine? And I have to tell them that I don't see one in the foreseeable future. It took 19 years to develop the hepatitis B vaccine, and that was a comparatively easy virus to understand. Also, vaccine development is a very difficult scientific achievement. If not produced with great care, a vaccine can cause as much illness and death as the disease is supposed to attack. And by the way, some of our scientists predict that we'll be able to take the very first step in vaccine development later this year. Tests will be made to determine the safety, the threshold of safety, for a kind of vaccine which does not itself seem very promising, but which may, on the other hand, lead us to the ultimate safe and effective vaccine that we're all looking for. Now for my third point. We don't know very much about AIDS, but we do know with complete certainty that the virus is transmitted from one person to another, either in blood or in semen. It's a peculiar trait for a virus, I'll admit, but that's the way it is. Now, this is one of the most important pieces of information we have so far. It explains, for example, why the initial alarm about AIDS was sounded among homosexual and bisexual men. Some homosexual sex practices not only produce semen, but they also cause some bleeding. And again, blood and semen are the only two body fluids that carry the live AIDS virus in quantities sufficient to be transmissible. Now, that information also explains why 17% of all AIDS cases are intravenous drug abusers who use a dirty needle that they've borrowed from another addict, and that individual already has AIDS. When we first began to confront the AIDS epidemic, the people at the highest risk were homosexual and bisexual men. I'm afraid they still are. 2 of every 3 cases involve these men, even though they've become much more cautious about their sexual practices because of their fear of AIDS. But nowadays, we're receiving more and more reports of the AIDS virus occurring among heterosexual men and women who are not IV drug abusers. In fact, their heterosexual activity would seem to be their only risk factor. As of last week, 4% of all reported cases of AIDS in this country were among heterosexual men and women, a percentage, by the way, that is climbing, and climbing rapidly. As I mentioned earlier, the numbers of AIDS cases will increase about 9-fold between now and the year 1991. But the number of AIDS cases involving heterosexual persons will increase about 20-fold. Over the past 5 years, when it looked as if the key group at risk were homosexual and bisexual men, we beamed to them virtually all of our information and education efforts. It was effective because their behavior does seem to have changed. But now that the rise in this disease is occurring among heterosexual men and women, we need to direct our information and education efforts out to society at large. Now, that's very hard to do in this country. We're a very large and very diverse society, and the cost of sending a message to everyone would be astronomical if, in fact, it could be achieved. But government has a particularly difficult time because, for reasons best known to the people here at the Kennedy School, Americans do not want their government to be that much of a big brother, regardless of how worthy its objective. So we've had to set some priorities and to make some tough choices. And I think we made the right choice when we decided to focus on informing young people about the dangers of AIDS. Heterosexual young people are now at high risk, that's true, but also their sexual activity over a long period of time will actually determine whether our society can survive this devastating disease or not. What we're doing then is sorting out all the information that can be life-saving for sexually active people, and that means almost any male or female between the ages of 12 and 80. And then we're focusing on those pieces of information that are especially pertinent to and can be readily understood by young people. That was the underlying plan for the Surgeon General's report on AIDS, which I released last October. Let me take just a minute here and explain how that report came about. We had been routinely keeping the President informed of developments on the AIDS front, and then in late 1985, the trend lines began to move sharply upward and our concerns deepened. But the American people still seemed unclear about the significance of this disease. In February of 1986, on the day after President Reagan delivered the State of the Union message, he addressed our department, HHS, and announced that he was instructing the Surgeon General to pull together everything we knew about AIDS and put it into a plain English report to the American people. For the next 8 months, I met with concerned individuals and groups from across a wide spectrum of our society, groups like the National Educational Association and the National PTA, the National Council of Churches, the Christian Life Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention, the Synagogue Council of America, and the National Conference of Catholic Bishops. I talked with the National Coalition of Black and Lesbian Gays and the Washington Business Group on Health. And I met in addition with representatives of local, county, state, and territorial health officials, also 26 groups in all. They were all extraordinarily candid and helpful. Each one also pledged to help get my report into the hands of every American. After 8 months of listening and writing, I delivered my report to the Cabinet and then to the President. It was accepted, and I released it on October 22, 1986. Incidentally, I would like you to know that at no time did anyone suggest to me that I make a little change here or a little change there. The final report I released in October was the exact same report that I personally wrote between February and September of last year. And I can further assure you that since that time, I have had no misgivings about anything that I wrote. It's true, and the report stands. I hope you've all read it. If not, please get down a pencil now, and I will give you an address. A.I.D.S, Post Office Box 14252, Washington, D.C. 20044, or pick up the telephone, call area code 301-443-0292. Let me repeat that. A.I.D.S, Post Office Box 14252, Washington, D.C. 20044, or call area code 301-443-0292. Now, there is much scientific and public health information in that report, but on the behavioral side, there are essentially just two messages, and I hope that they reach every one of this country's youngsters. The first message is simple enough. It says, find someone who is worthy of your love and respect, give that person both, and stay faithful to him or her. In other words, short of total abstinence, the best defense against AIDS is to maintain a faithful monogamous relationship in which you have only one continuing sexual partner, and that person is as faithful as you are. My advocacy of monogamy may sound like a morality lesson, but this is a situation in which morality and science happen to walk hand in hand toward the containment of this epidemic. My second message is for people who don't yet have a faithful monogamous relationship for whatever reason. The message is caution. It's important that you know with absolute certainty that neither you nor your partner is carrying the AIDS virus. If you are not absolutely certain, then you must take precautions. Look at it this way. Strictly from the point of view of epidemiology, when you have sex with someone, you're also having sex with everyone else with whom that person has had sex. And considering the long incubation period for the AIDS virus, we're talking about that person's history of sexual relations going back 10 years. And it also includes the sexual relations of all those people. It could be in the thousands. Even with this kind of information available, there will always be some people who won't abstain, yet won't achieve a faithful monogamous relationship either, and therefore they may expose themselves to others with the AIDS virus. To such individuals, I offer the following advice. Don't have sex with somebody who already has AIDS. That should be obvious enough. Don't have sex with someone who could be carrying the AIDS virus, a person, for example, who practices high-risk behavior. That includes homosexuals, intravenous drug users, prostitutes, and other persons who have many different sex partners. And the same message goes to any of those high-risk individuals. And finally, if you do decide to have sex with such a person anyway, then if you're a man, use a condom from start to finish. And if you're a woman, make sure that your male partner uses a condom, again, from start to finish. A condom will not provide 100% protection. Few things in life do. But so far, it seems to be the best protection available. If sexually active people will heed these messages, they will achieve a high degree of protection and will most likely not be infected with the AIDS virus. Well, what else can we do to combat this terrible disease? In my report on AIDS, I also advise people to avoid certain specific sex practices involving partners who are at high risk. Such practices include mouth contact with the penis, vagina, and rectum, and practices which can cause cuts or tears in the linings of the vagina, rectum, or penis, and having sex with female or male prostitutes. I also strongly advise people to stay clear of drugs and alcohol because these substances lower your ability to think clearly and protect yourself from danger, especially the danger of having sex with an AIDS-infected partner, and remember that the mortality is still 100%. Now, some people object to my advice because it sounds too much like a lesson in morality. And I guess it does, but I honestly do recognize that my job as Surgeon General is not primarily to make everyone a moral person, much as I personally might want to do so. Rather, I'm offering my advice so that everybody will be a live person, and I'm helping you protect your life because that is my job. Now let me pause for a moment and focus on an issue that is gaining almost as much attention as the AIDS virus itself, and the issue is, how should we educate our young people about AIDS and about their own sexuality? How should we do it? Who should do it? And when? When I talk to adults about the AIDS problem, and I make some of these detailed references to certain high-risk sex practices, I get a variety of reactions. They vary from dismay to sadness, disappointment, embarrassment, discomfort, and sometimes anger. But the reaction I most often get from young people is curiosity and an eagerness for more knowledge. They're still learning about their bodies and their emotions. They're still unsure about their own sexuality. And they still have that priceless optimism about the world and the people who live in it, an optimism that most adults have had tempered by the facts of day-to-day living in this real world. I prefer to speak about the need for AIDS education, and I truly believe we need such education at the appropriate age level in the schools of America. But I also recognize for many young people, such education may be frightening or puzzling or both. Hence, I believe that the most significant action our society might take to protect its young people from the mortal threat of AIDS is to provide them with education concerning their own sexuality, education that is factually correct, personally sensitive, and morally strong. The term sex education is one I'm not at all comfortable with because it tends to polarize almost any audience. Also, in my view, sex education usually means a course of instruction that is much too limited, and let me explain what I mean by that. Most of the time, when you hear the phrase sex education, you immediately think of class hours devoted to human reproductive biology, including carefully phrased explanations about the use and the abuse of male and female genitalia. I'm told that young people call these classes organ recitals. Now, most schools offer this minimum kind of sex education sometime during junior high or middle school years, and that's a good thing, although I think it might be just a little bit late. I personally would urge that the material be presented earlier among 9, 10, and 11-year-olds. Of course, developmental age is much more important than chronological age, and also community standards, which vary very much from place to place, must be taken into account. Nevertheless, children from 4 to 6 ask questions about sex, but these questions usually involve their own anatomy and the mystery of where do babies come from. Then for several years, until about 9, children seem to lose interest in matters concerning sex, but at 9 or so, a new interest develops, and their questions, if they are even asked at that age, may be quite sophisticated. I'm not rigid about the ages. Developmental age is much more important a measure than chronological age anyway. In any case, grade school children are extremely curious about themselves, and they are also kinder and more generous than older children, or even most adults for that matter, and they are above all susceptible to being loved and offering much love in return. And sex education without the concept of love and responsibility is like a piece of pie that's all crust and no filling. My own preference, therefore, would be to have our elementary schools introduce children to the subject of reproductive biology within a more general discussion of the nature of sensitive and affirmative human relations. Now, that's easier to say than to do, I know. And furthermore, some parents got uneasy about having schools impart certain human values to their children. They think that such instruction should be done at home. And I agree with that 100%. I always have, and this goes back to my many years during the time that I practiced medicine. I was in pediatric surgery, as some of you know, and my advice to parents has always been the same. The social and spiritual development of your children is your business. Don't pass it up, don't pass it by, but pass it on. And most parents would agree with me 100%. But many of them, I have to confess, never did much more than agree with me. That's been a disappointment, to be sure, and lately, in light of A.I.D.S, I've wondered why this is so. I don't have the ultimate answer, but I think I have a sense of the problem. I'm sure many parents have trouble dealing with the physiology and biology of sex, mainly because they themselves didn't get any of this information when they were kids either, and they feel inadequate. To paraphrase the wine taster's basic comment, it's a good excuse, but it's not a great excuse. Now, many parents also regard any talk about sex as a kind of invasion of privacy, their own privacy as well as the children's. Talk about sex is bedroom and bathroom talk, and those two rooms are universally regarded as the two most private rooms in anyone's home. So parents' uncertainty about the biology of sex and their sensitivity to the privacy of sex seem to be two reasons why they have a hard time with sex education. But there's also a third reason, and this may be the most important reason of all, but it is also the most difficult one to deal with. It has to do with the nature and the quality of our adult human relationships. As I indicated earlier, sex education means more to me than just another organ recital. Sex education ought to deal with relationships between men and women that are loving, caring, respectful, and tolerant. Such relationships include some fulfilling sexual activity, but they are not defined only by that activity. There's much more to human relationships than just good sex, and young people ought to be advised of that. For most adults, a satisfying relationship holds in a comfortable balance the emotional, intellectual, physical, and sexual factors that make up that relationship. Everyone dreams of such a relationship, and if we meet a man or woman who can give us that kind of relationship, we willingly give him or her our lifetime promise. Now, novelists call that true love. Sociologists call it marital fidelity. The Surgeon General has called it in this report monogamy. But whatever you call it, we all want that well-rounded, balanced, loving, fully considerate relationship, a relationship that is enriched by sex, not overwhelmed by it, but not devoid of it either. For many people, such a balanced relationship is an ideal, but real life is not always like that. It's imperfect, it's give and take. Grown-ups know about human imperfection, kids don't. And grown-ups can deal with human imperfection, but kids can't unless we help them. Without a compassionate understanding of the imperfect nature of many human relationships, a child's education will be itself very imperfect. So, if parents are to educate their children about human relationships, sexual and otherwise, they must first understand and accept the nature of their own. For many, that's very hard to do. Parents, adults, are not very good about talking to each other about their sexuality. They feel frustrated, guilty, and even angry about their inability to do the thing that they know, intellectually and emotionally, they should do, but they can't. Is it any wonder, then, that many parents have difficulty telling children about the full-dimensional nature of an ideal human relationship? Nevertheless, I really want parents to try. I want parents to do this with compassion, with respect, and with love, and with some understanding, not just of the child who's listening, but also of the adult who is speaking, and that's even harder to do. Still, it remains as my sincerest wish that the parents of this country will be the primary teachers of sex and human relationships to the children of this country. I say that knowing full well that some parents simply can't do it. When that's the case, then I believe there is a compelling social need for our schools, our churches, our synagogues, and other community institutions to do whatever possible to provide youngsters with the most helpful kinds of information. Our children don't live in a vacuum, as we all know. They live in a real world of pleasure and of danger, along with the rest of us. But we have some experience with it as adults and some sense of how to survive in it with our lives and our values intact. I believe, therefore, that each of us, in our homes or in our schools, has the moral responsibility to pass that information on to our children. I can tell you that the government, the United States Public Health Service in particular, will help in any way that we can. And the Surgeon General will continue to try to give that effort some leadership also. But there are limits to what the government can and ought to do. The task basically belongs to the home and to local schools and other community installations. It should not be left by default to the movies, television, or the street corner. We can't do that and still protect the millions of young lives that are at risk of AIDS. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this has been a very grim message, and I guess I am a grim courier. I only hope that every American who hears or reads my message will believe it and do his or her part to stop the spread of AIDS, protect and save the lives of people at risk, including unsuspecting young people, and return human sexuality back to its rightful place, part of the total complex of human, caring, interpersonal relationships. Such relations ought to be positive, hopeful, and safe. In my book, that's the meaning of the word true love, which leads me to my final word. It's not really mine. It's the last sentence of the novel, The Bridge of San Luis Rey, written by Thornton Wilder, who for a while was a favorite lecturer here at Harvard. Wilder concluded that novel by observing this: "There is a land of the living and a land of the dead, and the only bridge is love, the only survival, the only meaning." Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. My name is Valerie Southern, and thank you, Surgeon General Koop, for your presentation tonight. I am a representative of the student organizations responsible for this program this evening. And before I introduce the moderator for this evening, I think it's important that you know a few thoughts and feelings that the student organizations have regarding this subject. We have conducted research, and we have found that the National Academy of Sciences reported last year that the federal government's response to the AIDS epidemic has been dangerously inadequate. The Academy has called for a $2 billion a year educational and research effort to avert what it calls a medical catastrophe. The AIDS problem has become so urgent, it says, that it will require, quote, perhaps the most wide-ranging and intensive efforts ever made against an infectious disease. It is the hope of the 6 student organizations who have co-sponsored this event tonight that Surgeon General Koop will help us to explore these issues. For it is alarming to know what little we students do know. Our research tells us that AIDS is the Black Plague of the 80s. Our research confirms that since 1981, 30,000 Americans have been diagnosed, and more than half of whom have died. And our research confirms that the findings of the National Academy of Sciences is that in 3 years, we will lose as many Americans each year in AIDS deaths as were lost in the Vietnam War. So tonight we are overlooking our political differences for the purpose of acknowledging a passage in time that affects all of us as students. But you may be asking, who are we? Well, first, we're students, and in this we represent the spirit of the Kennedy School. We are a collective of men and women of every hue and color, of every political persuasion and thought that can be found here. Before I introduced our moderator, I want to introduce the student organizations who have co-sponsored this program. It would be good if the representatives of the organizations stood after I have completed the full list of sponsoring organizations. We are the Asian Caucus, the Black Caucus, the Gay and Lesbian Student Association, the Kennedy School Student Government in its entirety, the Latin American Student Association, and the Women's Caucus. Would the representatives please stand? Now, our moderator for this evening is Ms. Loretta McCloskey, a journalist and a medical editor for the Boston Globe. Ms. McLaughlin began her career in 1951, but started in Boston in 1964 as a medical news writer. She was among the first newspaper writers to begin coverage on AIDS and is responsible for 47 national, international, and local news accounts that have taken her readers to all points on the globe, including Haiti, Africa, Belgium, and France. According to Ms. McLaughlin, it is a sense of priority that has led her to publishing 17 editorials in the Boston Globe on the AIDS dilemma. Please welcome our moderator for this evening, Ms. Loretta McCloskey.
I think it was 17 editorials a year. I think it was 47 stories a year in 84 and 83. I think I was one of, if not the first medical writer in the United States to even mention the cost of AIDS, and to write the very first stories of heterosexual spread, and to write just simply many, many stories over this cruel and terrible disease among the homosexual population, the IV drug population, and now prostitutes. I think Dr. Koop did neglect to mention one route of transmission, which not very much has been made of, and that is through breast milk. And when we think of the dilemma of AIDS in Africa, and you think about how long it has taken to try to convince people to breastfeed, and now, once again, there will be a catch-22 in doing so. I think we are privileged, terribly privileged, to have Surgeon General Koop with us tonight. And I think the nation is truly privileged to have his report on AIDS as a primer on what needs to be done to limit the spread of this monstrous disease. Having said that, however, I'm sure Dr. Koop will understand that we're going to take advantage of him here tonight to sort of only quickly touch on some of the things he said, and to use the time, I hope, to even greater advantage, to talk about some of the things that he hasn't said and that haven't been done, and which should have been done a long time ago. Now, I have followed the AIDS outbreak. I am positively obsessed with the subject of AIDS. I check it every day, the first thing I do on all the wire services. I have been to the major meetings. And I am still, quite surprised, frankly, to come here and hear the Surgeon General of the United States sit and talk to an audience of this sophistication as if we were discussing the pros and cons of sex education. Sex education is not the issue before America. We didn't deal with that by this administration. They're sort of hiced on their own petard a little bit. They've opposed sex education. They have opposed many programs for better rights for homosexuals. We have limited programs for treatment of drug addicts. This meeting tonight does not take place in a vacuum. We have not had a day or two, or a month or two, or a year or two of AIDS. We have had 6 long, difficult years of AIDS. And I think that it is important, terribly important, that Dr. Koop now takes the stand that he takes with his primer. And it's too easy to say it comes late, because his primer comes late, and the National Academy of Sciences report comes late. And Congress coming around comes late. And it isn't that no one has been saying anything about this. We cannot behave. Upstairs before we came down, we had a little brief meeting, and people were saying something about what could we have done? Will someone ask the question? Oh, yes. Yes, the public will be asking the question, what could have been done? And what can we do now? Well, great many things could be done now. But the problem has existed from the very beginning, has been the nature of this disease. Very early in the ballgame, it was said in certain groups that if this case had first appeared in members of a U.S. Olympic team rather than in the homosexual community, the President of the United States himself would have had a very different response. And I tend to think that's true. We would have had the great marshalling of medical forces, and we would have had the great marshalling of money. And the money has come out very, very slowly. And even now, upstairs was saying, Dr. Koop said that how he has given the information on AIDS, steadily given them updated reports on the outbreak of this disease, but somehow does not seem to be, they don't become convinced of how serious a matter it is. They would so easily be convinced if we were talking about a new polio. It is because it is a sexual disease that we are so slow to face up to this one. And because I think for a long time the government thought they could get away with it, that it would stay limited to very socially undesirable groups. We have had an almost unbroken silence by the President himself. To my knowledge, there's only been 3 times that he's spoken out. Once was when he sent his condolences to Rock Hudson. One was, and he made an oblique reference to the value, perhaps, of banking one's own blood. And the last time I remember was when he called for Dr. Koop's report. And indeed he did. He said he wanted a full and thorough report and one that was understandable to the people. On the same day, the President, however, also asked that several tens of thousands of research funds be rescinded for AIDS research. And I think that message is clear to the public, too. I think that we haven't had, where has the leadership been in the cabinet? We actually had Margaret Heckler, who, despite many faults, did call AIDS the #1 health priority in this country way back in 1984. And now she is a visitor in Ireland. We did have Dr. Brandt, who was a physician, as Dr. Koop is, and who very early recognized the seriousness of this threat, and who sought very large budgets for AIDS much earlier. And there was no help for Dr. Brandt, and Dr. Brandt resigned from the United States Public Health Service. I just don't think it's good enough to come along in October of 1986 and suddenly appear as if you had been supporting funds and programs for AIDS for 3 or 4 years when that is not the case. Dr. Otis Bowen also has made a major statement on AIDS, one of the first. And he made his after Dr. Koop's report. He talks about a virtual apocalypse in Africa, and he's right. But where has he been? Messing around with modifying the Medicare program on catastrophic illnesses in ways that won't amount to much. The President is in the White House putting on his bush hat from Australia. Well, 100 more people diagnosed with AIDS that day, meaning 1,000 will have chronic AIDS and maybe 10,000 will get infected. We are diagnosing AIDS now at the rate, of 500 to 600 new cases a week. We really didn't still pay very much attention, until we had the seepage into the heterosexual population. And even CDC, an organization which I admire so much and do not wish to say one word against, but slow too, in putting out the statistics that it had collected for 3 or 4 years that showed that AIDS was a terrible problem for poor ethnic minorities in major cities who again, an underclass that is bearing the burden of this disease. And the CDC, slow to really accept the idea of heterosexual spread. It was right here at Harvard, only a year ago November, where Dr. Mason and Dr. Sensa of New York stood and said that they doubted very much that there was any spread of AIDS from females to males. And cast it in terms of, oh gee, you know, we're hard enough on the little ladies without putting that on them. And people who were there know what I'm saying is so. Now, Dr. Koop's report is really excellent. It says what you should do and it says how you should do it. But if it has one major flaw, it is that it doesn't mention money in any way, shape, or form. Now, if we are so sincere about teaching the American children how to protect themselves against AIDS and the American public, where is the money to come from? Why wasn't there a great call for funds, as the National Academy of Sciences did? The President this year has asked for $100 million more than last year. And this paltry amount of money is being sought in the presence of an approaching epidemic that the National Academy of Sciences, not exactly a hysterically emotional group, says is catastrophic. I think there is a certain, I'm sorry, but to me, a taste of hypocrisy to so much of what is said about AIDS. If Dr. Koop, if Dr. Bowen really want to reach the American public, if the President does, if this is a national health emergency, why doesn't he commandeer 3 hours on ABC, NBC, CBS? Why doesn't he do it? Why doesn't he do it with the President standing beside him? I think it was courageous of Dr. Koop to go into the lion's den with his report, going last month down to Jerry Falwell's Liberty University, and a week ago to do the same thing before the National Convention of Religious Broadcasters, or whatever they're called. And quite rightly, he told those groups that his overriding duty was as a health official, and that's right, and to sound the alarm against AIDS. But to my mind, it's unconscionable that the Surgeon General of the United States of America feels compelled to go defend his medical stance on such an enormously serious subject before such groups. I can't remember the last time that a medical matter had to be sort of okayed or defended in such forums. It's understandable. Hours on ABC, NBC, CBS. Why doesn't he do it? Why doesn't he do it with the President standing beside him? I think it was courageous of Dr. Koop to go into the lion's den with his report, going last month down to Jerry Falwell's Liberty University, and a week ago to do the same thing before the National Convention of Religious Broadcasters, or whatever they're called. And quite rightly, he told those groups that his overriding duty was as a health official, and that's right, and to sound the alarm against AIDS. But to my mind, It's unconscionable that the Surgeon General of the United States of America feels compelled to go defend his medical stance on such an enormously serious subject before such groups. I can't remember the last time that a medical matter had to be sort of okayed or defended in such forums. It's understandable that he does so, though, because the politics of AIDS still prevail. There are many big holes in this current AIDS picture, and most of them have the same political basis, that information or a big program on AIDS, the feeling is it still just doesn't sit well with the White House. One problem still is the definition of AIDS. We still only mandate the reporting of the end stage of the disease, acute, lethal AIDS. Most AIDS experts now feel that this definition has lost its original usefulness. And we should be reporting all cases of people who are showing any mental or physical symptoms of AIDS, so that we could have an accurate count, so that we might be able to see where it's going. These people also need social services and medical services, and they'd lose some of them because they don't quite qualify under the strict definition. We don't separate in the reporting of any other disease those who have mild or severe manifestations of it. Why are we doing this with AIDS? But probably because by clinging to an overly strict definition, we keep the count down, the public count down, and therefore minimize it as a political issue. But no one answered the question this way upstairs. But as you all say, what more can be done? What will happen? I tell you that I predict that AIDS will be a major national political issue in 1988. By then we will have 120,000 cases, more than 60,000 dead, the old Vietnam War analogy. All of this, by the way, will have happened, quote, on the watch of this administration. And while no one certainly can blame the administration for the outbreak of AIDS, we shall see how the public judges the way it was handled and whether the challenge is being met or not. You see, the whole problem isn't whether we tell the kiddies or we don't tell the kiddies, or whether we tell the grown-ups really or we don't. The problem is that the disease spreads, and time is the enemy, and the pool of virus grows in the society. And we keep telling everybody over and over that this is an unprecedented disease in modern medical times, and then we go on behaving like it was some unusual form of measles. We're still arguing about the niceties of TV condiments. We're still worrying about the cost to the healthcare system. We wonder what it's going to do to the insurance system. We don't know exactly what we really want to tell the people about AIDS, by the way. What is our goal? Do we want to tell them to do safe sex or to do no sex? What is it we really do want to tell the folks? Now, I really would like to ask, I burn with certain questions that probably aren't yours. I'm not an academician, I'm not a medicine person, so forth. I represent the public curiosity. And I would really like to know, what has the president really been told? How often is he told? What does he say when he's told? Does the president worry about his own status as a high-risk person for AIDS? He is, you know. He had multiple transfusions of blood since the AIDS outbreak began. Does he worry about his children, young adults, who surely have the same sexual urgings that all the rest of the people in this room have? Does he really understand how bad it is already? That 1 in 10 adults in New York City is probably carrying the AIDS virus? 1 in 25 in Boston? Do we all really understand that doomed means doomed? Because it will be no medicine in a year and a half or 2 years, and there will certainly not be a vaccine. Does Caspar Weinberger or George Shultz really get the picture about AIDS? The threat to the national military, the threat to the international world, the threat to the State Department, the threat to the Peace Corps. Does Jerry Falwell understand what is going to happen to the world missionary? Seriously? When now in certain cities in Africa, 10, maybe 20%, maybe 30% of the adult population is positive for AIDS? Do the companies of America understand their workers are going to be going to these countries and the blood supply is not safe or even tested? Do you all understand that members of the State Department in Rwanda, according to the newspapers I read, are allowed to go to Europe to have their teeth cleaned to protect them from the threat of AIDS? Well, that's the way I see it. It's a little differently, I think. I don't think we've begun to do enough. Well, there's no war on AIDS going on. I ask my children every day, nice grown-up children, have you seen a poster anyplace about AIDS? No. In Europe, you know, they can send pamphlets to every household. We just put through a new income tax. Really, are we so lacking in imagination that we couldn't have printed on the back of one of those forms, you know, how to protect yourself against AIDS? Wouldn't cost any postage. Well, I must say that meeting Dr. Koop here tonight and looking at him, he sort of reminds me of Captain Ahab. I suppose it's the beard. And somehow I kept thinking how the analogy holds about the great white whale. And the great white whale that's out there is the AIDS epidemic. And it grows larger and larger and more ferocious and more ferocious. And now Dr. Koop calls us to follow him, and indeed we should, to go and get the whale and do him in. But the question that I keep wondering about, is it already too late? Is that whale already so far ahead of us, so much more ferocious than we really begin to think he is, that you know, we're not going to beat him with these meager little weapons we have at hand so far. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ground rules here. We're going to get Dr. Koop to make a short comment, and then we're going to take questions from the audience. If you want to ask a question, should line up at one of the microphones, either here on the ground floor on either side or on the first floor. This event is being taped for rebroadcast on public radio, and so that's why for asking your questions you need to appear at one of the microphones. But we'll start with Dr. Koop for a comment.
I wish that I had the power and the authority that most of my detractors think I have in the government. Surgeon General Julie has neither power nor money. Anything that I have done in the 5 years I have been Surgeon General is done by moral suasion and with borrowed money, or money that I have convinced other people that they should spend. My responsibility for AIDS has been limited to one thing, and that is the writing of the report. My responsibility for that began in February 1986, and before that time, by fiat, I was not associated in any way with the AIDS effort. Now, I say those things because although the commentator criticized the administration, I think, more than she had criticized me, I just want you to know what my role is. We don't all have the ability to sit in a position of editorial power and to criticize things that men of goodwill try their very best to accomplish in a very, very complex federal government. And I would not want you to think that the people at CDC or in the Public Health Service are mindless. We are as frustrated as you are about many of the things that happen, not just with AIDS, but with other things that government's responsible for. Our government is huge. I've been there only 5 years, but it reminds me of a freight train going down a track, and you're told by your superior, do anything you want with it. It's almost impossible because the driver is hermetically sealed in the cab. Now, that's all I'm going to say. That's all I'm going to say about this subject, because I didn't come here to defend either myself or the administration, but I would think it would be rather unfair if you went away from here thinking that all of the accusations you've heard tonight are true and that we aren't trying and aren't attempting to do some of the things that the commentator thinks should be done. And I think we will accomplish them. And indeed, the white whale may very well be too far away to catch, in which case we'll all suffer very seriously because of that.
So we'll start here with the question on the right, and let me ask you to put your questions succinctly, please.
All right, I'd like to move away from a political question and just ask you a public health question. You've said that AIDS is transmitted only in blood and semen, yet you've recommended against all forms of oral sex. And I wonder if you can tell us just how easily transmitted is AIDS in heterosexual genital and oral sex?
I can't answer that question with the clarity that you'd like me to do, but I can say that there are enough concerns about scientists in academia, in the government, and elsewhere, here and abroad, that if you want to be on the absolutely safe side, maybe that's something you ought to avoid. It is true that the virus does appear in other body fluids, but apparently not in sufficient strength to be transmissible, or there is something inhibiting the virus in the fluid in which it is transmitted.
How about here on the left?
My name is Larry Kessler, the director of the AIDS Action Committee, and as I said upstairs, Dr. Koop, I am very grateful for your report and for the work you've done. I'm grateful you've come to Boston. I'm grateful for your courage. I am appalled that your statement is so homophobic, that when you talk about love between individuals, please talk about love between men and women, as well as between men and women. And that the safe sex is for everyone. And it is possible, I think, in the age of AIDS to have sex. But secondly, I lost my train of thought. I am so angry. I'm sorry. But because you have a role and a responsibility in a forum that very few other Americans have, that's why it's important. When you're out there speaking, I hope that you can incorporate some of that language in your talk and your presentation, because the rest of your report, I think, is sensitive and it's encouraging, and it's what we need to hear. But we need to also set some of the issues aside so that we can think clearly about AIDS and about the real threat, which is this virus. Thank you.
That was a statement, not a question, but I hope your anger wasn't directed at me. I think my position on homophobia is very clear. made it very clear in my report that we are fighting a disease and not people. I made it very clear that I am the Surgeon General of all of the people, not just of heterosexual people. It is not always possible in a brief statement before an audience in limited time to say everything that one believes.
Why don't we go to the, oh, I'm sorry, here, yes, on the right-hand side.
Well, I appreciate being involved in this. I think myself somewhat privileged to have heard these remarks. But I am annoyed, perhaps not as much so as the fellow who's fighting against this disease from an entirely different point of view. But I'm annoyed at the fact that something is lacking here, terribly lacking. And if you indulge me, I'll try to express this as best as possible. I'll be extremely brief, but I really do think it's very important. A year ago, 2 Christmases ago, I went to visit my brother, 27 years old, young man in New York, vibrant life, cared about a lot of people, had a career. And it was Christmas, and I had my fiancée with me at the time. We were dropping off a bottle of wine because he had, very, very quickly. And we entered his apartment, and we discovered it was black. There was no light on. And he was sitting in the middle of the apartment. We dropped off the wine, and we didn't want to interfere with his privacy, and we left. About a month and a half later, I got a call from my mother that said my brother was admitted into the hospital because he had a very severe nosebleed. And things began to strike me in the back of my mind. My brother was gay. And sure enough, when I went to visit him in the hospital, he explained something I already knew, but explained to my future wife and I that he had AIDS. He didn't have to explain it. Because outside of his door in a hospital, there was this gigantic red sign that said, "Leave food trays outside." My brother, in fact, had to, despite the fact he had pneumonia, had to on several occasions, because of a lack of nursing attention, of a lack of doctor attention, go out and get his own tray. He later recovered from the pneumonitis, and actually recovered quite well and gave us all a considerable amount of hope. He was one of 10 kids. And we all supported him very greatly. And we were told by social workers and like how unusual this was for a family to come to his aid and be so giving and the like, because that's not the way it usually occurs. And he returned to his apartment, but kept it very, very quiet that he had AIDS because he was afraid he might be thrown out of the apartment. And sure enough, his employer abandoned him, and a lot of the benefits he was going to get he was abandoned of. And many of his friends who weren't of the homosexual persuasion or bisexual persuasion abandoned him. And he found that his life shrank, as did his very body. And sure enough, during the summer, he succumbed to another attack of, unrelated to AIDS, but other attack of diseases that he didn't have an immune system to fight off. And again, he was in the hospital. He remained there for 9 weeks. And again, the same syndrome. People wouldn't come in. We couldn't get the proper care for him alike. Now, the only reason I bring this to everyone's attention, he unfortunately eventually died. And before he did, he said, "Look, I'm not a homosexual. I'm not a person with AIDS. You know, I'm Edward Columbia. I'm just a person." And the reason why I am so annoyed that this was missing is because this is a very important aspect of it. Because education begins in this room of 160 people. 160 people, not the 2 people up here, not the forum that brings us together, not the student organizations that tell us to listen to these 2 particular points of view. But the fact that each one of us have to leave here and understand that this is a disease that affects human beings. And that individuals in proper forms, greater than the Surgeon General, but entertainers and popular people, are being forced not to speak out as their inner soul might tell them to, because they're fearful of the stigma. And we all carry the potential of it. I know my family did. I know I do. We all carry the potential of it, and it's something we should all work very, very conscientiously at. This is a disease that affects human beings, people who need to be treated like human beings, and as we treat them as human beings, we'll come to understand a great deal more about this disease.
I agree with those things indeed. It's reprehensible, the treatment the young man had in the hospital. Certainly none of the dicta that have been provided by the Public Health Service in reference to health workers in hospitals would indicate that any such treatment as that is indicated. And I have agreed, in my report, indeed calls for extraordinary compassion in dealing with the people who have AIDS, because the sick with AIDS will impact upon every member of our society. There are so many people who have AIDS in the form of the virus now, and with what we project for the future, it is unlikely that anybody in this room will be able to go through his life without having the impact of AIDS in some way hit him, even though he himself or his family members may not be involved with the disease process.
Dr. Coop, we're in the midst of a great national upsurge of concern about drug use, but it's a wave of concern that's really focused primarily on marijuana and cocaine. And heroin has both been relatively and absolutely neglected. Do you have any hope of persuading both federal, but more to the point, state and local drug enforcement officials that they've got a role to play in controlling the AIDS epidemic?
Again, I go back to moral suasion, no power. I have on several occasions taken to the proper people a very earnest plea that we have an opportunity to get two birds with one stone, and it would be a great mistake not to include AIDS education in reference to intravenous drug abuse. I will continue to fight for that, only with moral suasion.
Okay, let's go up here to the balcony.
Dr. Coop, my name is Jonathan Handel. I'm a gay man, and I'm chair of the Cambridge Human Rights Commission. And I'm concerned, obviously, both about AIDS and also about civil liberties. I'll say as a statement that I agree with Ms. McLaughlin that the administration's actions around AIDS and around the civil liberties implications of AIDS have been shameful. I don't expect you to respond to that because you've already indicated the degree to which you can respond to the hermetically sealed freight train. The question that I'll ask you in that regard, though, is about testing. I think one of the civil liberties dangers associated with AIDS, one of the forms in which people can respond in a way that brings you closer and closer to what one might call the panic stage, is the creeping spread of testing that we're seeing, of testing for HIV in society. It started, I guess, with military, foreign service personnel, the Job Corps, because people live together in bunk rooms when they're working on the Job Corps. We have insurance companies across the country. In this state, insurance companies are trying to cast aside the insurance commissioner's rule that prohibits testing. The CDC has floated a proposal that anyone applying for a marriage license would have to get an AIDS blood test, and that anyone being admitted to a hospital, which I gather is about 35 million people a year, would have to get a blood test. In all of this, very little concern or little strict provision for confidentiality, for non-discrimination, based on sexual orientation when that's inferred or gathered from the blood test. I'd like to know what your position is on testing as it sort of widens.
Well, in a hearing before Congressman Waxman's committee this morning, I took a fair beating from Congressman William Dannemeyer because of my opposition to testing. I have taken a very firm position upon this, as has the Public Health Service. And we have taken criticism from all sorts of people because we have believed that testing in a mandatory way would do things that would not help prevent the spread of this epidemic, would impinge upon the civil rights of many people, and because of certain rulings that have been made by the Justice Department and because of the stigma associated with AIDS, would be extraordinarily unfair to certain people. So my position on that is clear. The testing that has been recommended, not demanded by CDC, is in order to get a better handle on the absolute distribution of seropositivity. And it seemed that as long as it were confidential, that people being admitted to hospitals could be tested that way. It would not impinge upon their civil rights. It would never become known who was positive, just how many were positive. And it would seem that many people who look forward to marriage would not object to knowing that each of the partners in that coming marriage had a clean bill of health, or if they did not, they then knew what precautions they could take. I think that the matter of testing may undergo some changes. There will be a conference in Atlanta about 800 people of very extraordinary faculty on the 24th and 25th of this month to study the question about whether or not our policy of no mandatory testing is still valid as this white whale continues to get away from us. What the findings of that meeting will be, I do not know, but it certainly will be one of the most important AIDS meetings of the year.
Okay, here on the right-hand balcony.
Yes, my name is Dave Peterson. Apparently, getting back to this issue of testing, the American public is not too satisfied with the activities of the administration. In a Newsweek poll, 87% said that all risk groups should be tested for AIDS. 71% said that everybody who works in a hospital, a teacher, or other food handlers should be tested for AIDS. The majority said that the disease should both be reportable and that everyone should be tested. Now, Dr. Gallo of the National Institute of Health has called for a Manhattan-style effort, just the way we built the atomic bomb in World War II, to combat this disease, to put together a major effort of that sort. Now, there is a massive cover-up going on between all the press and the administration about the question of whether this disease and how it's transmitted. There is no scientific unanimity, the way you will see on the television normally presented. Insects of 5 different types have been found with AIDS as carriers of AIDS in Africa, and there is no definitive information that cannot be spread that way. Aerosols is another possible transmission route. Cases have been found where biting another person has caused AIDS. Cases have been found where saliva, 2 cases in Europe, has transmitted AIDS. Now, the Reagan administration has just taken a massive amount of research grants. $325 million have been taken away from these research grants. Your policy, and you yourself and the administration, is a fraud. You're allowing the American public to be subjected to the greatest epidemic in history without lifting a finger to protect the public, and the people of this country are angry. And my question is, are you waiting for Don Regan to come around to the position that we no longer have an economic recovery before we can spend a few dollars in the order of $1 billion to $2 billion to put this disease under control?
Okay, I think we got the question, yes. A short answer.
I'm sorry anybody clapped about that, because that was a disgraceful statement.
It's a massive cover-up. You're covering up the AIDS disease in Africa.
I'm sorry to end on that question, indeed, but we've come to our witching hour here. I think we want to thank Dr. Koop for coming back to be with us again, and I apologize to the people who didn't get to put their questions. We look forward to having him back again soon, and we're glad for the discussion. Thank you.